Two mysterious green children arrived in 12th century Suffolk. We've wondered what could have accounted for their strange colour, and we've asked if they were fairies or just foreign. In this last episode, we'll think about the transmission of the story itself. Does this give us any extra clues about that question? Who were the Green Children of Woolpit? We have seen how two men in different parts of medieval England had both told a very similar tale, and we know that Ralph of Coggeshall had heard the story from a local nobleman, Sir Richard de Calne. De Calne had met and looked after the Green Children when they had turned up, and the girl had worked in his household for many subsequent years. We haven't looked at how William of Newburgh, all the way up in Yorkshire, heard though. William belonged to the order of St Augustine.
He does seem to have had contacts in East Anglia. He gives an account of this pogrom against Jews, massacre of Jews in King's Lynn, as if it's coming from a local source there. But there are several monasteries of William's own order. Ixworth is quite close to Bardwell, Wicks, Sir Richard de Corn's house. But there are others, there's one at Thetford, so there are other sources down there. So how closely they relate to each other is not quite sure. Cistercians, like Coggeshall, do seem to have kept very closely in touch with each other. Augustinians, perhaps not so much. But I think William did have sources in East Anglia, whatever they were, I don't know.
Did William's account come subsequent to Ralph's, who was closer to events after all? We know that the Ralph version we have was written subsequently to William's. It's in the Coggeshall Abbey Chronicles. But had he written it down at an earlier stage, and this is just another version? How was the story transmitted? Who wrote it down first?
I think it's hard to say, but my view, I mean, having looked at a lot of medieval manuscripts and accounts of this kind, having read both accounts in the original Latin, I do not see telltale evidence that one scribe is textually dependent on the other. So there are no telltale signs of phrases that are being lifted directly. I think that these are two men who have actually received the same story from a folk source, from a pre-existing oral source, and these are different sources recounting the same story. So I think it's impossible from a textual point of view, it's impossible to give any kind of idea of who wrote it down first.
So it obviously had spread out. It was oral history. It was a folk tale in a sense. People were telling the tale for a few years at any rate, for perhaps a couple of generations before it dropped out of circulation.
If the Green Children's story was a kind of popular urban legend of its day, that doesn't mean nothing happened, of course. It could just mean that the story became sort of optimised in the telling, and our two chroniclers do have very different styles and different missions in their storytelling. Which differences matter the most?
Two things, I think. One is the report of what actually happened. The other one is the children's story. Those are totally different. William says, indeed, that they were herding their father's cattle one day, and then something happened. They don't know what. Suddenly found themselves in the fields around Woolpit, where the harvesters found them. Rafe, on the other hand, goes into this long story about they followed the cattle into a cave, got lost, wandered through the cave for a long time, heard the sounds of bells, enticing them on, followed the sounds of the bells, and came out in a pit on the edge of the fields of Woolpit, which is a folk tale. It's a sort of mirror image of several folk tales about people following animals into a cave and coming out in a different world, in fairyland, in the other world. Because he clearly did believe that these kids did come from another world, somewhere, a fairyland of some sort. So I think over the years he has, both in his own mind, to improve the story, has added in bits and pieces that he's picked up from elsewhere. Whereas William does not do that. William is a more, shall we say, accurate historian in the modern sense.
Yes, it's interesting because William is generally considered to be the more kind of factually concerned of the two chroniclers. He does seem to have a particular interest in recording this story as precisely as possible and as closely to the events as he can get. And yet geographically, he's the furthest away. So he's writing up in Yorkshire, whereas Ralph of Coggeshall is geographically close, writing in a Cistercian abbey in nearby Essex, and also appears to have a connection with some of the families who are involved. So particularly the de Calne family of Wicks, wherever exactly this place Wicks is, which is disputed, but they are a family that is associated with the Colchester area and with patronage of Coggeshall Abbey.
With such differences between the accounts, perhaps we should ask whether 12th century people drew a distinction between fact and myth in quite the same way that we do. Is this just about a gap, a conceptual gap over centuries, a different way of treating information?
I think William of Newbury is a good example. I mean, he, in his opening chapters of his history, he starts his history in 1066, basically. But he refers to Geoffrey of Monmouth and the history of the kings of Britain, and he says this is nonsense. There was never a King Arthur. He never conquered the whole of Europe. What he really takes objection to was apparently Geoffrey making fictional kings or placing bishops in places that never had a bishop to fit his story. And he says what Geoffrey did is taking the fictions of the Britons, the fables, and dressing them in the proper coat of history. He is misleading people by writing history, but it's not history, it's not real history, it's fiction.
So he had a conceptual difference between historia and fabula, history and fable.
This is why he hesitates about the Green Children story. He says, I hesitated for a long time, but he was convinced by so many good witnesses and reports that he said, I am not ashamed to sort of tell this tale. He eventually became convinced it was historia. It was res gestae. It's the only one where he says that, actually. I mean, he tells other tales about theft of a cup from a fairy hill, about toads and even dogs found living enclosed in rocks and things like that. But with the Green Children in particular, he obviously took a long time to decide, yes, this really happened. I can't explain it. He feels he doesn't have to explain it, basically. You don't explain these things. All you can report is that they actually happened.
People in the 12th century did have a conceptual toolkit to distinguish between history and mythology, between this world and the supernatural. We'd probably disagree with some of their categories, but they did know there were some things which were mysterious, which were ultimately perfectly natural.
Now we generally call those things miracles, which being preternatural, as ascribed to divine power, as when a virgin gives birth, when Lazarus is raised from the dead, or when diseased limbs are made whole again, while we call those things marvels which are beyond our comprehension, even though they are natural, In fact, the inability to explain why a thing is so constitutes a marvel.
And so, yeah, it's difficult to get any sense of motivation, really. I think from William, my view would be that he is somebody interested in mirabilia, in these kind of natural wonders of the earth. Or what we would call today Forteana, looking at things that we can't understand precisely because we can't understand them, and fascinated by the secret things of God, as people in the Middle Ages would have seen it. Whereas Ralph, I think, is more a local boy portraying a local story which has been told to him by somebody connected with Coggeshall Abbey. That would be my interpretation.
For me, there's a rather large elephant in the room, and that's the social class issue. The Green Children were found by agricultural workers at harvest time, who took them to a local Anglo-Norman nobleman. The girl survived to give her own account of the journey, but we don't have a witness statement. The story clearly circulated among many different people of who knows what background. There were at least 4 different languages easily spoken in this part of England, each representing different culture and traditions. There were 2 ways of dealing with stories, the folk stories of the English working class and the romances of the Anglo-Norman elite. Eventually the story comes to us via 2 religious men. Everything has been filtered through people and backgrounds and cultures a dozen times over before we get to it. This story has served the needs of everybody who's ever told it. How can we sum it all up?
My opinion is that the Green Children were real, but they weren't fairies. Ralph Coggeshall does his level best to make them otherworldly, and that was quite acceptable in the Middle Ages. Whether they called them fairies or whatever they called them, it was quite acceptable to believe there were other worlds. It had its own rules, but it was accepted that these otherworldly people existed. William New is not quite so sure. He isn't really convinced about the other world. He has entities he calls demons, or evil angels, who are sort of elementals, who can take on the form of humans, possibly, or devils, but they are sort of occult philosophy sorts of beings. They are natural, they're not supernatural, but he's explaining them in a different way. So I think the medieval chroniclers and philosophers had great difficulty about trying to turn a popular belief in otherworldly fairies into something that fitted into Christian philosophy.
There were 2 green children. We don't know how green, but it was green enough to talk about, and there's at least one written indicator that it may have been quite green. If this was green from a common cause like anemia, then the wealthy folks of East Anglia would presumably not have taken the trouble to comment upon it. For a while, this seems to have been a popular tale. In the retelling, the story has attracted a lot of improvements. But it also has some clearly folktale or mythological elements, like an underworld and the problem with eating otherworldly food. The 2 accounts we have been filtered through different social classes, different languages, different belief traditions, to the point that we're not looking at an eyewitness report anymore. After all this, the Green Children of Woolpit remain a mystery.